yeah, the first part is kind of a recap of this pretty basic proposal that I made a couple of weeks ago, or a general idea that behavior and morphology columns might be, models might be in separate columns. And one might also call it going full Monty, since you know what
Oh,
he referenced before. So that's the code name I'm using for it now. Because, well, yeah, just following Mountcastle's proposal to the end that whatever each column models just depends on the input it receives. So very quickly, here's our current model. We have movement and feature input from the sensor going through the thalamus. Movement input goes in here, or layer 6. The feature input goes into layer 4. And then we talked before that perhaps orientation input goes at the border and kind of activates the mini columns, and then features might cause like very specific activations within the mini columns. And then we have associative connections between layer 4 and layer 6 that learn which features are at what locations. Layer 6 is the location on the object, and then A is location on the object, B orientation of the object, and the orientation of the object can be used to rotate both the incoming movement vector and the incoming orientation feature. Over time, those activations get pooled into something one might call an object ID. So which objects are we sensing overall? And that is kind of stable. So as we move over an object, the sensations that come in and that are in layer 4 and layer 6 change at every step, but that remains stable as long as we're on the same object. Okay, and then we can also have this kind of feedback input from a higher level column that tells this column which location it should expect to be at, and then this kind of broader context signal to multiple columns in the lower level in the hierarchy in layer 1 that can be connected to like layer 2, 3, 5A. Not 100% sure exactly what each of these get out of this context signal. So far so good, nothing new here. So now what we kind of introduced when we talked about behavior models is, well, what if there's just a parallel system? We get changes and directions as input to upper layer 3 and layer 3 mini columns. We got a movement vector as input to layer 5B. We have basically two reference frames, one for the behavior model, one for the morphology model. That one also has an orientation which can be used to rotate the input. We also have associative connections, in this case, maybe between layer 3 and layer 5B. And those
I'm sorry. Did it require doubling up on these things? I thought it didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't require a separate movement vector and a separate orientation vector. I thought those were shared.
They need to be separate if we want to be able to recognize behaviors and morphologies independently of each other in independent orientations.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry.
So yeah, then they get pooled into a behavior ID. And yeah, that's then the additional thing would be that there's some kind of time signal in layer 1 that we can have neurons in layer 3 synapse to, and kind of have some temporal conditioning on what changes to expect at which locations. And so, do you notice something in this picture?
Wow. So you were making double lines of everything.
Yeah, so 1, there are doubles of everything, and 2, there's no interaction between these two things. So blue and green don't really interact at all within this column.
But we talked about how they would, right? It wasn't like we
well, all the interactions so far that we talked about were always between two hierarchically arranged.
Oh, that's true.
regions.
Right. We tried to do original within a column.
Yeah.
And we said that's getting hard. So we said let's do it hierarchically.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, for sure we talked about lot of different interactions between behavior and morphology models, and there need to be some, but the kind of solutions we came up with so far were always two hierarchically arranged regions. And
Yeah, I
so
guess the only one I can think of that was, but it was a fairly weak one, or not like one that's hard to replicate, but just that a behavior can bias an ID recognition and vice versa. So I don't know, recognizing the banana morphology will bias the banana peeling behavior and vice versa. But
yeah,
that's easy to do with voting and stuff like that. So that I don't think
yeah,
that's okay.
that would work the same
Well,
way with voting across columns.
well, I guess the general thing what Niels just said is an interesting one, I think, is that sometimes behaviors are intimately associated with objects and they're not generally shared. And in fact, they start off being associated with objects. So sharing behaviors generalized in other objects is sort of the...
Yeah, and we did also say that like you can have a behavior at the lower level column and then associate the behavior ID with the location on an object. So saying at this location, that object has a certain behavior. But that's again hierarchically that behaviors in the lower column and then but yeah, so the general proposal would be to kind of to just separate out the blue and the green, which would allow us to kind of move everything back into the original layer positioning, so we don't have to kind of shift things around a bit to make space for more functionality. And then we could also generalize it a bit and say that this layer 1 input in the morphology object could be more something like state. Like, for example, if an object can have multiple morphological states, that could be a conditioning for that. Or it could be like whatever's passed down in the feedback connections.
It seems to me that time is appropriate for both of these.
Yeah,
Not, but
yeah,
you don't have to separate out. You just say time is always there.
right. Yeah, so it could be. I guess what I was kind of getting at is that this could generally be considered as something like context or state, and context can be time in a sequence, or it can be a behavioral state or an action condition state, or it could be
Right,
like,
but there's different cell populations to project this layer 1, so it's not like one thing.
yeah.
Right. So time is this kind of a state.
Yeah, maybe it would help to show, I guess we almost need to add a separate connection, which is the, what you call it, matrix cells. But I like that, idea of, because it fits with kind of what is instead of behavior in the morphological models, they're learning the different keyframes that when an object stops moving, and those would kind of have these different state variables that recover them. Kind of.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yeah, in a nutshell, this is kind of the proposal. Instead of having each learning module required to have like 2 reference frames and all the machinery doubled up, just having different learning modules or different columns that receive different types of input. So they might receive like features or orientations at locations for the morphology model. They would receive changes at locations for the behavior model. And then the reason why I first thought of this was actually because I was thinking about the feature model or like surface model of like basically this kind of 2D map that you can wrap around the surface of an object as like a general feature map, which could receive features like colors, but then 2D movement vectors along the surface of the object. So there might be other.
This is a new idea that you're just throwing in here, right? In the sense right? In the sense, no.
I showed this, I think, some weeks ago.
Well, what I mean is today's topic. You were saying, let's take our jack of all trades column and break it into 2 parts.
Yeah.
And now you're telling me you're breaking into 3 parts, which is like,
well, I'm mostly saying it for context because that was kind of the reason why I thought of the idea, because I was thinking about these surface models. All right. In the past, we talked about there being 3 types of models: morphology, behavior, and feature models. And the feature model seems to be more like a two-dimensional thing that can kind of wrap around an object. And that's, we started talking about that topic because we were talking about object deformations, I think.
In my mind, I was, go ahead, George.
I think we also wanted to learn like a general like class of morphologies. I think that's an idea that Jeffrey presented like again like a month ago.
Yeah.
So we wanted to separate out
like classes.
Yeah. So we wanted to separate it out like the morphology portion from the features that are associated with the morphology, and hence this feature stream separate thing came out from what I remember.
And I remember, I think I posted this idea on Slack, and then Jeff, you said something like, it would be a bit much to expect of a column to have 3 reference frames now to be able to present those 3 models.
Right.
So then I thought, well, yeah, it wouldn't actually have to be in the same column in this case. And then I thought, oh, why does the behavior model even need to be in the same column?
Right. Well, I guess I didn't absorb the idea or accept the idea that surface model and morphology models are 2 things. In my mind, I was still trying to assume they were in the same column. And you've gone one step further.
Yeah, I'm going full Monty, so.
Yeah. Well, of course, this begs the question, the next thing is, where are these different modules and how do they relate? And
Glad you asked. So, this was all stuff I kind of proposed before, but then last week I did a bit more of a deep dive into the literature of particularly where's kind of motion processed in the visual stream. And so the very first figure that I found that was kind of what I was looking for was actually this figure, which shows that with just like one vertical electrode penetration, so basically within the same column, they find both direction selective cells and orientation selective cells of different sizes of bars and non-orientation selective cells. And I was thinking, oh no, I just made all of these slides and animations, and this is not working, because if this was the proposal, I wouldn't assume to find like motion selective cells and orientation selective cells in the same column. So
well, you would expect to see.
I guess, is that the same column? Because it doesn't look like a perpendicular projection.
Yeah, it is. And I also looked, like, as I dug deeper, there are like all these maps of response properties and everything in V1 that I can show later. I have a bunch of like MISC slides at the end for whatever questions come up. But basically, this was the first thing I saw, but then I read further, and within the same
Can you go back? Can you go back? Next, just checking my understanding. The problem here is the little thing box named number 1. That we would expect to see directional sensitive cells in layer 6 for the morphology and the feature model, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So
really
this is sure. Yeah.
Those are down there. It's really just the upper ones that are the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, this is expected.
You said it right. I'm just double checking my.
Yeah. And so I read further in the same paper and saw, okay, this is an interesting thing. The cells, the feed-forward projections to MT, which is classically thought of as an area responsible for motion processing, they actually come from layer 4, layer 4B specifically. They come from layer 4B and layer 6, but they don't come from layer 2-3, which is where usually the classical feed-forward projections come from. And the layer 3 outputs from V1 go to V2. And so maybe I'll skip this beautiful picture for now. We can get back to that. Here's another kind of visualization of that. That's retrograde labeling of neurons in V1 that basically they injected the dye in MT. And then these are the neurons in V1 that project to MT. and they're not in layer 3, but they are mostly in layer 4b, and some of them in layer 6, in upper layer 6. And they're about 10 times more in layer 4b than in layer 6. And most of them, like 80% of them, target excitatory cells in MT. And those are also independent of the blobs in V1. And so here, these are just two diagrams from two different papers kind of showing the same thing, the same anatomy, which is this projection from the spiny stellate cells in V1 going directly to MT. And those are in layer 4. There's the same arrow here, layer 4B going directly to MT. And then 4B also projects to V2, but this is a different cell population. Those are mostly pyramidal cells. And we can come back to those figures for more details in a bit, but maybe just to kind of get to my main thought that I had when I saw this was that V1 is could be kind of like a relay directly sending motion information to MT to be modeled there, because it doesn't seem to be really processed much more in V1. It doesn't get pooled into a representation in layer 2, 3, and then sent forward. Instead, it enters from the magnocellular pathway into layer 4B alpha, goes up to 4B, and then gets projected to MT directly. And then there's another pathway to MT, which is also, it's this other population of pyramidal cells that projects to V2, the thick stripes in V2. On the other picture, it would be this arrow here. And then from there this actually there it actually exits in layer 2, 3, and then projects to MT. And from
Viviane,
yeah.
I mean, do you have a guess as to why, or thought as to why why you have these extra layers in V1? I mean, couldn't the magnocellular cells project directly to MT? Why do they have to go through this sort of extra layers in V1? Why don't they just go right to MT?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to get at now. So with the kind of second pathway through V2, the physiological studies show that it seems like this input integrates more three-dimensional motion information. So actually the disparity between the two eyes. So it takes disparity into account at the point in V2 at this point. So maybe V1 also does some kind of processing to take depth or some more global information into account to get kind of motion information in world space instead of retinal space. That's what I was...
Right. Well, I always held that hypothesis, right? I've proved that out several times in the past, but somehow dealing with the fact you're trying to get to a 3D representation.
Yeah.
But still, it doesn't tell me why couldn't that processing be done? I mean, couldn't everything here be done just by having two separate pathways coming out of the thalamus? Like one projects to MT and one projects to B1. I mean, I don't think it's important. I just didn't know if you had a thought about the matter. And if you did.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer on why there's kind of this arrow here and what would be happening in between those two. Like, why does it go through layer 4 of V1 and not directly from the magnocellular cells to MT? I would guess my guess would be that there's some kind of local integration of information for getting from retinal space to world space of movement.
Right.
Because it seems like that's happening in V2.
Right. And it seems like it's a total mystery to me. So I just thought if you had some insight, that'd be great. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It could also be just an accident of evolution, somehow.
Yeah.
Because there are mammals that don't have this striate V1, they're missing something.
Right. Yeah, I should mention everything I'm showing here is primates. So,
Right. So, and then the evolution comes along and says, well, hey, we're going to discover something new. It's easier just to change a few cells in existing places than to add a whole nother structure, or, it could be just an action of evolution. So it can't be, but okay, I'll keep going.
Yeah. And I saw this paper here, which I thought was, meshed kind of well with what I was thinking. I can just read out the marked parts. So first of all, just to give some context, what the paper's about, they say some neurons in extrastriate area MT are capable of signaling the global motion of complex patterns. Neurons randomly sampled from V1, on the other hand, respond only to the motion of individual oriented components. The neurons that project from V1 to MT were directionally selective and, like other V1 neurons, responded only to the motion of components of complex patterns. So maybe that's another hint of what is happening in V1, that it kind of makes sure that the motion is associated with one object or something like that. And then, the projection neurons were predominantly special complex, responsive to a broad range of spatial and temporal frequencies. And then here's kind of the interpretation that consistent with the notion that V1 acts as a clearinghouse of basic visual measurements, distributing information appropriately to higher cortical areas for specialized analysis. So that potentially, V1 is kind of a special region in that sense, in that it maybe kind of sorts this information partially. It might still do modeling there as well, but at least layer 4B might be kind of sorting out some of the change information, just feed forwarded to a column in MT where it then learns the behavior model. So yeah, this is kind of my interpretation mapped onto this figure, plus adding some columns here, where purple is the behavior model pathway and blue is morphology and feature model pathway. So the parvocellular input goes into layer 4C beta, and then it gets pulled up into layer 2-3, and then depending on whether it's blob or interblob, it goes to the thin or pale stripes in V2, and then from there to V4. And then for the behavior models, there's a magnocellular pathway input that then goes to layer 4B, and from there directly into MT. Those cells are highly direction selective.
The idea is you're saying MT has the behavioral model.
Yeah. I'll show that in just a second. And that basically this kind of pathway through V2 would extract some more three-dimensional motion information that then also gets input to MT. And there's also feedback connectivity between MT and V1. And the interesting thing is that connectivity is also a bit atypical in that those feedback connections, they mostly come from layer 6, and then they mostly terminate in layer 6, but also in layer 4B, which is not usual for the feedback connections. Some of them terminate in layer 1, but only at high eccentricities, which kind of makes sense if you would think that this is a behavior model. It wouldn't tell you much about an object ID in V1, I would assume. And so, I thought that was just another interesting thing. And so on a high level, my rough idea was that potentially the ventral stream could contain the feature and morphology models, starting in V1, then V2, V4, and the dorsal stream to MT would potentially contain behavior models. And the kind of pathway through V1 and V2 would be responsible for some motion processing, like incorporating disparity. There's also some directionally sensitive information going to V2 and V4, but people have kind of proposed that that might be more for motion-based shape processing, so like figure ground segmentation or detecting motion borders of objects. And then lastly, this is a bit more vague. It could be that if we do have like feature and morphology models, it could be that morphology models are the interblobs, which are labeled form here, and the pale stripes, and feature models could be the blobs, which is why you detect 2-3, and people can assign color to that. That could be blobs and thin stripes, but yeah, that's a bit more out there of a proposal, I guess. That's that. I have a bunch more like just random evidence and fun facts about visual processing. But
So would you say that the relationship between the three streams, morphology, features, behavior, morphology and features are kind of like horizontally kind of in the same level while the behavior is one on top? I guess I'm trying to understand like how these three different kinds of elements could be grouped as a unit, or maybe we don't have to do that. Like,
I guess in Monty, I feel like they would be basically the same. It's not like they would have different hierarchical relationships or anything. And
okay,
how I was thinking of it is that the brain just kind of separates everything in different ways. So like it clusters different orientation preferences and then direction preferences and ocular dominance columns and all that. It kind of separates all these different properties out, and so it could separate out the behavior models as well, and the morphology models and the feature models in blobs, but not necessarily making any of them more or less important or
okay,
lower level.
okay. And then are the color blocks all within one column? Like as in we're separating out the feature and the morphology, like the morphology being like the inter blob area, but within a column, my understanding was that there's both, which
Yeah,
kind of goes back. Yeah. I mean, I like the separation idea, but I guess it's just like a devil's advocate for, like, okay, I think blobs and interblobs happen in one column.
yeah, that is definitely an argument against it. I'm not sure. It was the most reasonable thing that currently makes sense for me, because those are just in layer 2, 3. And if you would imagine having a model of like the surface of an object and how color and stuff is mapped onto that,
Yeah.
I would expect those to kind of change the activation in layer 2, 3 in a consistent way, which might look like
Mhm.
color. But
Or I mean, in implementation, we can make them separate, but somehow like these are more like, intimately connected in the sense that like, okay, it must be kind of laterally like connected. I mean, we can like strictly follow the biology of like they must be in one, or kind of represent that in a different way, but the meaning the same. Might be a very important point. Okay,
yeah,
right now.
Nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
That's really nice.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, yeah, thanks for the nice overview. I mean, yeah, I definitely still think this is interesting. And yeah, it's crazy how complex the connectivity of V1 actually is. Um,
Yeah.
I was curious. Did you have a chance to look much at like how V4 and MT are connected and stuff, and like how that might fit with kind of the old ways of what you call it, like how behavior would map, or kind of like change predictions of a morphology model, like what connections could help with that?
Yeah, I didn't look at V4. I looked at V2 and V1 connectivity to MT.
Yeah.
V2 the forward projections to MT, a layer 3 to layer 3 and 4. And then the backward projections from MT to V2 are from layer 3A and mostly layer 6 to layer 1 and 6. So that's kind of...
Yes, as if MT is hierarchically above.
Yeah, right.
Which I think fits with, that's why I'd be curious with V4, because I think MT is often kind of alongside, but I guess it's a hierarchy, so you can slice it many ways.
Yeah. And then V1, it's a bit atypical. So feed forward comes from layer 4B and layer 6, not from layer 2, 3. It goes into layer 4 and 6 in MT. Then feedback connections come from layer 3 and 6, same as 2v2, and then end in layer 4b and 6.
And that was the one I guess you were talking about.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So, could you go back a few slides where you had the flow chart of like V1 going to MT or this one. Yeah. I guess I just don't know the anatomy like very well about how close MT is to V1. Like the fact that the spiny stellate, which in my mind, what they look like are basically pyramidal but shorter.
The pyramidal cells without the apical dendrite.
Yeah, I think they can still have long axons.
Right. Oh, okay, so they can still project too.
I think the argument was they're exactly the same as pyramidal cells minus the apical dendrite. So
okay,
that's the interpretation I adopted that was proposed by someone.
Okay, but they can still connect to MT because I guess a lot of the I thought that spine cells were mostly for connections with the like a layer. So
no, they have long range projections.
Okay, and the other this is a minor question, but I know somebody did like research into the third pony cell. I forget the name, the one that they
yeah
by chance. Yeah, okay, I'm saying it right. And do we figure out more about? I just don't remember like what we decided about. Or find out about it. I can just look up in Google Docs.
I don't think we reach any conclusions.
The only extra image I have on them is this review study that looked at like over 100 of studies, and that shows this connectivity of choricellular input to layer 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not sure.
Wasn't there some kind of overlap with the matrix cells? Maybe I'm misremembering, but
that would match this, I guess, maybe.
But I mean, I think one of my favorite things about this still is just the idea of simplifying each learning module. Like I think that is really nice because
yeah, I forgot my main slide.
Oh, okay, nice.
Not the main slide, I guess. But benefits, it's a relatively simple change, and then kind of the evolutionary argument is environments usually don't have behaviors, so this might have been a capability that needed to evolve in the neocortex to model objects. And so it seems like the cortical pre-processing before getting to MT columns may be a reasonable small addition that doesn't require a whole other set of connections for behavior models within a column, and would make that much easier to kind of just add that capability.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It kind of reminds me, I think in like I think there's some mammals or maybe it's marsupials or something that they don't have motor cortex, but they also they don't have as like fine-grained kind of dexterity as, for example, primates and stuff like that. But I just feel like it kind of fits with behavior in cortex being kind of like a special thing rather than something that's represented everywhere. Because that comes to mind as like well, everything has bodies, so surely everything needs to be able to model the behaviors of their own body. But I think the point is actually a lot of animals don't, and that's why they have more simplistic kind of behavioral models, or like they're maybe all model free, kind of.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I can look up again which animals it is that that applies to. But it's basically some animals that have cortex don't have motor cortex, but it does generally come with a more limited kind of dexterity and stuff, I think.
Have you thought about how do we connect motor models with, or behavioral models with objects?
Yeah. So what I was thinking was that we could basically use the feedback connections, which go both to V1 and V2. I'm not sure. I would have to look up the MT.
Well, just think about it in terms of Monty, for example. Let's say we are modeling a bunch of learning models that are learning behaviors. I mean, those behaviors have to be learned in the context of specific objects. And we want to associate those with those objects, but then we want to apply them to other objects. I just didn't, it's a very high level block diagram. How would those connections be made? Is there a topology associated there or not? I guess not. I mean, it's sort of like mechanics. I'm trying to imagine the mechanics of, it might work out fine. I just didn't know if you thought about it.
Yeah, I haven't had the time to think a lot more about how we would apply a behavior to a morphology now. I think it would still be the same mechanism, because nothing really changes in the requirements if we separate the behavior and morphology models out there, just physically maybe more apart from each other. But since since before we assumed to use backward feedback connections, basically from V2 to V1, for example, I would assume the same thing could still be happening from MT to V1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just some kind of co-localization in inputs, which kind of fits with the idea that you would learn this behavior at the same time as this morphology if they were looking at the same thing.
Well, it derived from the same retinotopic map. So I suppose if I see a behavior in a new, it just might work out. It might work out fine. Just thinking.
Yeah, and MT is also retinotopically organized.
Right. I have if we're running out of time, I have a general proposal. It may not. It's consistent with things I've said in the past.
Yeah, do you want me to stop share?
No, it doesn't matter. I can see you all. If you want to stop.
Very useful to keep up.
Yeah, you might want to leave it up. Doesn't matter. There's Monty is not a brain simulator, right? It's an AI system. And the trick all along has been to figure out what parts of the brain we need to pay attention to, which parts of the brains we don't need to pay attention to. And in some ways, that's the most difficult exercise for anyone who wants to build a neural computer, is to know what parts you have to pay attention to, which parts you don't. So I think we've been particularly good at that in the past. And so, there's no spikes here. There's a lot of stuff we got to ignore. I think some of these details we're talking about right on this picture right here are details which we probably, in the end, be inspired by, but really don't have to think about emulating at all. To me, Monty's already progressed enough that we need to, we're moving less and less, relying less and less on the neuroscience and more on machine learning ideas, because as long as we don't abandon sensory motor learning and a repetitive, common algorithm, we can't go too wrong. So I just think we shouldn't spend too much time on these details. So I'm already saying, okay, you've proposed a major architectural change to Monty, which is to separate out learning modules that are specifically for learning behaviors. So that's a great idea. And so I think at some point quickly we should think about, how would we implement that in Monty. And I don't think looking at all these things going on in these layer 4s and, these stuff just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do think
But you
more broad.
asked.
Okay. All right. Do you want me to stop? I can stop if you want, but let me tell you what some of my concerns are. I've always reserved sort of MT as this is a pretty major thing in the brain. I always felt that it was sort of modeling egocentric spaces, and so it would model both behaviors and arrangements in egocentric space. And now if you're going to make MT do something else, then I ask myself, do we still need to model egocentric spaces and arrangements of things in egocentric spaces? And if not MT, where? So that's a concern of mine. That's a pretty high level thing. It's more like, it's neuroscience, but it's also like, okay, it's a big idea.
Yeah, I guess that ties in a bit with the voting question we discussed earlier, that at the moment, basically all of the learning modules have access to egocentric location information. And I guess we could continue to let all of them have that kind of information if we find it practical, but
right. And at some point, it doesn't matter if it's the way the brain's doing it. Yeah. I think when, Niels and Viviane started this project, we talked about the essential elements that have to be in Monty. The things that are the core principles that we cannot violate. And those include the distributed learning system, integration of sensory motor integration. And as I said a moment ago, there's a lot of variation and that we could around that. And I think you guys have already done an amazing job of doing that. Monty isn't a neural simulator. It does its own things and it has its own ways of doing stuff, which is fine. I think it's great. In fact, it should be that way. So I guess I'm just pointing out that this is a major change you're proposing. I think we need to think through the implications for Monty and not worry about too much.
Although, maybe this is what you're going to say, Vivi, but
yeah.
It's actually maybe a simpler.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I like this proposal so much is that it changes behavior models from a major architectural change to a pre-minor change.
Right.
Yeah. So to add, if we do allow behavior models to be in separate learning modules from morphology models, then the main thing we need is just a different sensor module that outputs changes and directions instead of orientations and features, and just plug that into the existing learning module. Otherwise, we would have to rewrite our learning modules to have basically two models at the same time and test both of those at the same time. So it actually makes the change simpler.
Right. So I agree. So that's the beauty of it.
And then,
so anyway,
just to highlight that it's not the only thing that would be needed, but the biggest change that's necessary in either solution is to give learning modules the ability to state condition its models. So depending on incoming context, like time or state, expect different features in different locations. And we would need that capability either way, but that's the biggest change.
And it also feels like, a nice feature to have for the morphology models. Like it feels like it gets towards, I don't know, some of this kind of deformation, keyframe kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so in like very concrete Monty terms, this would be kind of like keyframes or multiple graphs for each object that lead to the same object label. And the state could also become part of the output of each learning module, like something that it infers. And it can inform other learning modules on what state to expect. Like a state in a behavior model informs which state in morphology to expect. And voting can happen on state to quickly infer.
We talked about all this back in January, didn't we? I mean, there's just stuff I think we were discussing back then.
Yeah.
So that's not really a change as much as it's still there.
Yeah, it's more like an elaboration of like this.
It is more what Monty needs, because Monty does not have it right now.
Yeah, this is stuff that's not in Monty right now.
But it's not. Before we even proposed separating out learning modules as separate. I mean, behavioral models separately. we identified the need for this. So
Yeah.
this is not a new requirement. You're just reminding us that we still have to do this.
Right. So yeah, I'm just saying, no matter how we implement behaviors, we need this. And yeah, this is basically, if I were to implement behaviors today in Monty, these would be the 3 steps I would take. Make a new sensor module, give learning modules the ability to state condition its models. And then third would be to give a learning module the ability for the behavior to apply movement to another learning module's movement input, which is the one that's still the most unclear in my head of how it would happen in the neocortex and how it would happen in Monty. But basically, like, how do we apply a behavior to a morphology? This kind of idea of applying movement to the morphology model's reference frame.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so, yeah, it does. I hope this maybe makes the proposal more concrete for people who are more thinking in terms of Monty. I was mostly going deeper into the literature because it was really interesting, and also I wanted to see if it's kind of a realistic thing to think about, that they could be separated physically.
Yeah. I think the thing I would look for there is I look for physiological studies of MT. Like, what do they know that MT does? That's the kind of thing I would look for. But regardless, I mean, I know when we start getting to those striate V1 connections, it's just a huge morass of data, and it can be very, very confusing. And so I sometimes I worry about everyone on the call. So look at this guy, what the hell are we doing? It's like it's so complex. But we don't have to do that. Right? Our reliance on neuroscience will go down over the years.
I looked at some MT reviews and studies.
You're anticipating every one of my questions here.
Oh, sorry?
You sort of like you anticipate every one of my questions here.
No, it was more like I really had a lot of fun getting to read some neuroscience papers again, so I did a lot more of it than I was planning to.
Yeah, but you have the slide right here that's available, right? Okay.
Yeah, but I read this MT review paper, and it had talked about like all the connectivity, but it didn't even mention feedback connections. I mean, it was all just about feed-forward processing. But yeah, I think it's hard with the response properties in MT because the experiments are so simplistic. If you like, it's hard to find a paper that would actually detect that it's modeling an object behavior.
Right.
So I can only find like some general things like orientation tuning and binocular disparity tuning, directional selectivity. Yeah. And yeah, they say it's quite complex.
There could be some sort of, studies where they disable MT in an animal doing a high-level task, and see what the deficit is. I mean, that's the classic example we've talked a lot about. You deactivate MT, and now the person can recognize an object, but they can't reach for it, type of thing.
Yeah, I did.
Which I always felt like that's indicative of egocentric space modeling.
Yeah, I'm not sure which. I saw some papers on that, but I think they didn't have nice figures to put on a slide. Yeah. I think this was the review paper. One of MT's main functions, above and beyond what is done in V1, concerns integration and segmentation. MT appears to have built-in mechanisms to deal with inappropriate merging of independently moving objects. For example, opponency has a disparity constraint and possibly other constraints to limit integration to a particular depth. Mm-hmm. Neurons tend to segment motion from its background. MT is involved in the computation of structure.
Yeah, it's all like.
Oh, here.
You apply this to almost anything.
MT responses and the perception of 3D cylinders The remarkable integration of direction, speed, and disparity gradients all make a compelling case that MT is processing motion, but doing more than computing the direction of speed and motion.
Yeah, that would be behaviors.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just trying to pull up something from Joshua Tenenbaum's group and stuff on because they do a lot about like intuitive physics and stuff, and they do definitely talk about the dorsal stream being more implicated in that, I think.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking this morning before our meeting, I was like going back to this list of basic topics I presented a few weeks ago. I was thinking like, all right, let's tackle something basic, like recognize an object and go out and pick it up, bring it into some pose, so how do I do that? Right. How do I take these ideas and implement that? That's sort of the test here in the end. Okay, great. We're modeling behaviors separately from this and that. Well, okay, well, how do we do something basic with it?
But yeah, what I think's cool is, yeah, kind of like you're proposing, Vivian, like if we were going to implement this in the grand scheme of things, it would be a pretty straightforward thing to add relative to at least some changes you could imagine for behaviors. And so it might not be that long before we can just start testing it and kind of seeing how it works. And
Right.
and like you can almost imagine, like let's say we do revert back at some point to behaviors being in every column. I feel like what would be implemented, the code for this separate one, would probably be how you'd want to encapsulate it for it to be a component in a learning module anyways. So like, yeah, it feels unlikely that we would be wasting time by trying this and seeing how it works.
No, it seems like a reasonable assumption to go forward on. So
Yeah, and actually, I was just thinking we could start with 1 and 2 while 3 is not completely figured out yet. Like just kind of testing what do we learn if we connect a sensor module that sends changes to learning module? Does it learn a behavior? Can it recognize a behavior? And then also adding the capability for learning modules to kind of model time or different states. Generally, a useful thing that we will need either way. And then both of those should give us really interesting results and capabilities on their own, even without being able to apply a behavior to a morphology yet. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
yeah. So can I ask my question? So I've always, from the very, very beginning of my interest in brains, I've always thought about music, right? So would this suggest that learning a melody, that the actual melody itself is in the behavioral model, and that the instance of that melody, the key and the instrumentation and specifics, are in the morphology model, or the feature model?
Yeah, I guess you could think of the intervals as changes in frequency, and then that would be a behavior model. But then the specific key it's in, I guess those are features that
Right, you're
apply
applying
to that.
it. So one of the problems I had when we did the behavioral model back in January at a offsite, I said, "Wow, this could solve the melody problem, which is recognizing melody in different keys." But I couldn't. But if when it was in a single column, I couldn't work because I said, well, a single column generally represents a certain set of frequencies, or it responds best. I started reading the literature about brain's representation of sound. But the problem was that by having them co-located in the same column, it was hard for me to apply the melody, which is a behavior, to a completely different space in the feature space, which is the actual key. It just didn't work. And how could you? I mean, I have to like apply this behavior melody to some other part of the cortex, which is representing different frequencies. So, but now by separating them out, I still have I have the ability to apply a behavioral model in quote the behavioral model space I should be able to apply it to any place else in the morphology model space, right? And the mechanism for those to communicate should be somehow more flexible enough to accommodate that. So I could take this melody and apply it to different keys, which are represented in different places in auditory cortex. I guess it's a
Yeah, it's interesting to
But-
think about.
yeah.
Yeah, because we've talked a few times about the connection of like displacements to invariance and song recognition and stuff.
Right.
But I agree it's fair with them separate.
With a melody, though, aren't you recognizing the intervals between the notes and not the notes themselves?
Right.
No, that's the displacement. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the displacement. And right, and that's the problem, right? Because it turns out you can readily, well, there's a lot of details to that. I mean, first of all, most people do know the key they learned the song in. They think they don't, but they do. So when you hear Paul McCartney singing, yesterday, or the key actually, if you think you don't, but you can hear that's the melody played in any key, and it sounds just as good as any other key. It's like there's no preference in some sense. It's like, so anyway, right. Yeah, there's the interval. That's the trick. Anyway, I think the behavioral model has the ability to capture the intervals.
Yeah, so to make that more concrete, it's basically like the same way like a feet, like diagonal bars or whatever moving. That's kind of like the movement in the frequency space.
Yeah, I can't remember when we talked about it in January. It seemed like it was going to solve that problem. I don't remember how. But
I think part of it was also the matrix cell stuff that you're bringing in and stuff. But yeah,
well, that's the matrix cell is just purely timing.
Hmm.
And I think I've had that all along. Anyway, that's great. I think it's a pretty major addition to Monty, but not a lot of work, I guess.
Yeah, it will probably be more work than it looks like on the slide now. But yeah, I at least have a pretty concrete idea now of how I would get started implementing a behavior in Monty.
Right. So I guess in summary, in January, we came up with the general idea of how to model behaviors, but we assumed it was going to happen in the same learning modules as the morphology module. And now we said, oh no, it's really a separate one. And so this is sort of completing the picture. We're going on to the next stage in the evolution of behaviors. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, if you're all on board with this, separating them out, and
Does anyone argue against it?
no, I think it's definitely something to. Yeah, I think unless we have a really good reason to reverse it, which we don't, and I think I mean the story you've presented is pretty compelling. Like we were like, oh, we need reference frames, and it's like, oh, we need this transformation, then we need this. Like, oh yeah, wait, everything's been doubled.
Right, and
like
maybe
that's because it's just another learning module.
The thing that bothered me is it required a whole nother set of sort of grid cell equivalents that were driven by the same motion vectors, but anchored differently. I was like, yeah, could do it, but that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, I think this is much neater.
That's a lot to ask for a column.
Yeah, a lot of grid cell modules to fit into.
Right, we have trouble fitting one set in there, let alone two.
Okay, cool. That's
right.
exciting.
Great,
I'm happy.